Hello. In this part of the lecture, I would like to talk about a tool for product design which is very useful. It is the Gestalt principles for perceptual grouping. In that case, actually, we use a huge amount of knowledge which is based on German psychologists from 1920s. They started to develop some ideas for perceptual grouping. Mostly, they talked about visual perception. In that case, it was very important. And try to understand how we perceive the world in terms of things and objects, but not in pixels. And for them, it was very important to understand the organization of the visual elements into groups. And Gestalt means actually unified whole. In that case, also symbolize very well perceptual grouping. And for us, of course, in our issue, we would like to make sound design, not visual design. Therefore, we try to implement these ideas to the auditory domain. And in that case, another scientist, Ol Bregman, has developed a lot of very interesting ideas. And in his book, Auditory Scene Analysis, you can find very detailed information on it. And I will also give some examples. Therefore, in this issue, we try to implement or find some analogies from the visual design to the sound design. Therefore, I will start, first of all, the ideas from the psychologists for the visual design and try to also describe how can we use for auditory design. Actually, there are different principles which were developed by these psychologists as Gestalt laws for perceptual grouping. One of them is the similarity. Objects with similar properties, for example, color, shape, and so on, will be grouped or will be seen as belonging together, will be grouped together. Also, proximity is another principle. In that case, nearby objects are grouped each other. Also, continuation and closure are important issues. The perception tends to see complete figures or forms, even if they are incomplete. And in most cases, our attention is quite important. Our perception tries to define a figure and ground and make some attention for the figure. And therefore, also, there's a Gestalt law for figure and ground. If we start with first example with similarity, the principle of similarity actually states that things which share visual characteristics such as shape, size, or color, or texture, or orientation will be seen as belonging together. In this slide, we see some figures. And of course, in this case, we see some triangles and also circles. And we group circles as a column, circle rows together. Also triangles. In that case, shape is very important for the grouping. It is also possible to use color, like this example. Of course, in that case, we have two objects, one of them red, the other one is the black, and we group both of them. Another principle is the proximity. As I already discussed about it, actually nearby shapes, nearby parameters are grouped together. In that case, objects, shapes which are close to one another appears to form groups. And we have in this slide two pictures. In the first picture, we have some squares, a lot of squares. And in that picture, because of their location, of course, we perceive as a one group. And in the second picture, we see that three groups separately, two columns are grouped each other. We can see in that slide much more better. It's columns. Another principle is the closure. We have a tendency to see complete figures and forms, and therefore, in that slide, for example, in the first picture, we see a triangle, white triangle, but actually there is no any triangle there, but we have a feeling that we feel it, and we have a feeling that there's a triangle, white triangle. Also in the second picture, we see a white spherical object. In that case, there is no spherical object, but we perceive it. And third picture, in the panda picture, again, it is not complete, but we perceive it as a complete panda. Also in visual domain, figure ground is a good example. Elements are perceived as either figure, objects of focus, or ground, the background on which the figure rests. Actually, in this slide, we see an example, Faceless Vase drawing that Danish psychologist Edgar Rubin described. And depending on our focus, our attention, in some cases we perceive a vase or we perceive two faces. And in our daily life, we use, of course, this focus or attention very well for complex situations. Of course, we can transform. We can find some analogies for the auditory domain, for auditory grouping. In that case, of course, we don't have shapes and colors. In that case, we have other parameters. For example, frequency, temporal aspects, or sequential integration is a very important issue. For example, melody. Of course, it is based on temporal and frequency aspects. But we have some analogies with visual examples. For example, I have selected, for example, spatial dimension of distance is analogous in auditory domain to the separation in frequency or separation in time. And in that case, we use separation in frequency or separation in time for the grouping. I will give for it some examples. Also, there are some other rules. For example, it is very unlikely that a sound will terminate at exactly the moment that another begins. Also, in a mixture of sounds, moment of sounds that resemble one another can be grouped, have a tendency that they belong to same happening. Very important issue in auditory domain is the masking. It is a little bit different from the visual domain. In that case, white noise or other kind of noises mask, of course, tones and so on. And we think that although the tones are missing, this masking causes that tone will be continued. For example, for closure effect, quite important. Also, in auditory domain, we have, similar to the vision, competition between the forces of attraction. It means that there are different effects, and one of them wins at the end because they make always competition. In most cases, not only frequency and temporal aspects are quite important, also spatial location. If the sound components are coming from the same location, we perceive as one object. I would like to give some examples. For example, I would like to start with proximity. In that case, we will hear some sounds, some tones. We see in this picture on the time domain, first of all. In the time domain, some of them are very close to each other, and in some cases, there are big distances. big silences. In frequency domain, we see that all these tones have same frequency. In that case, frequency is same. And therefore, in that case, of course, we grouped these tones depending on the time separation. And I would like to play this sound now. As you can notice that, first of all, we group these 2 tones and then 3 tones, again 2 tones and 3 tones. This was very similar to the proximity effect which we discussed in visual domain. There are also other effects or similarity and proximity can be also used in auditory domain. And in this example, also a very interesting issue is the temporal axis, time axis. Here we will hear again some tones at different frequencies, for example, higher or lower frequencies. In the first picture, we see that 3 tones at high frequencies and 3 tones at lower frequencies with an order, first of all, high frequency and then low frequency, high frequency, again low frequency, high frequency, low frequency. And in that case, because of the temporal aspects, we group them as a one melody. But the interesting and funny point is that if the cycle of tones will be presented faster, as second example, we perceive that, or we group higher frequencies as a one melody and lower frequencies as a separate melody. It means that we have 2 melodies and separate them from each other. Although actually in time and frequency domain, they have big similarities. First of all, I would like to present this first example, one melody example. If I present them faster as the second picture, we will notice that we group them into the 2 melodies, high frequencies and low frequencies as 2 different groups. As I already explained that in auditory domain, we have also masking effects. For example, white noise or other type of noises cause that some tones can be masked, and we learned it. And therefore, if we hear some noises in between of some tones, we think that these tones continue, although they are missing. And in this example, we will hear the march of Turca from the Mozart with some noises. It is very similar to the visual closure effect. Of course, some aspects are quite different. And also, the figure ground effect, which we discussed already in visual domain, existing also for auditory domain. In that case, I would like to play the Beethoven's piano sonata. And in that case, you will notice that at the first we focus another aspects, and the second part we focus other aspects. as we heard that we differentiate depending on our focus to figure and ground, and most of the musicians use these effects, and also for product sound design, it is quite important. Using this kind of issues, we try to develop some tools for product sound design. Of course, there are other tools, but because of the time limitation, I discussed in this lecture Gestalt principles, which is very fundamental for the product sound design. And I will continue in the next part with sound synthesis and discuss another tool.